Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining our event today. My name is Yao Nyako. I'm a professor of economics at NYU Abu Dhabi and NYU New York. Uh, Today's event is being hosted by the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. You just saw the slideshow on them. We thank the entire team for all of the hard work they've done in putting today's event together. We are part of DevLab, which is a new center at NYU Abu Dhabi, um, aimed at showcasing the importance of development economics. We believe that in Abu Dhabi, we're sort of at the crossroads, if you will, close to many developing countries, close to many developed countries, and therefore we're in a unique place to talk about development economics. Today is going to be a great conversation. But before we go there, let me introduce our Chief Academic Officer, the Provost of NYU Abu Dhabi, who's going to talk a little bit about the institution. Before he gets on, I just can't resist a few words about him. He is, of course, a wonderful mathematician, physicist. He's coming to us from Duke University via MIT and Princeton, does work on the mathematics of the general theory. Really interesting stuff. But for those of us in development economics, I just am sorry for going on this. But he's also written a book on finance. He's interested in many of the same things we are interested in development economics. He's taught finance classes. And so he's a natural person to make some remarks on this. And I'm not done yet. The other thing I like so much about him is that he hasn't forgotten his roots, and is in his home country, Belize. He has a research institute there, and he's helping the folks there, capacity building. And as I was Googling the remarks for today's talk, I just saw that he had been mentioned in his home country's newspapers, okay, about all the things he's doing. So it gives me great joy to introduce to all of us the Provost of NYU Abu Dhabi, Ali Peters. Please, Ali.
Right. Greetings, everyone. Yao, thank you for such a kind introduction. Indeed, the Dev Lab is one of those areas of activities that's dear to my heart. I will say universities are powerful engines for the cities and countries they're located in and for the world. Higher education has positive outcomes for individuals like myself and societies in every measure. And as an institution motivated by research questions that matter, this seminar aligns so well with NYU Abu Dhabi's mission. Our purpose is defined by excellence in teaching, learning, and research, advancing cooperation and progress on humanity's shared challenges, shaping and examining our scholarly endeavors through diverse international and multicultural perspectives, and fostering a dynamic ecosystem which enables and leverages the tools of disciplinary and interdisciplinary exploration. The Dev Lab is an interdisciplinary laboratory supported by our Division of Social Science and led by faculty in economics, politics, social science, and computer science. The lab serves as a focal point at NYUAD to create knowledge and training for faculty and students to pursue fieldwork and research with practical applications for the people on the ground. It is an exciting addition to NYUAD and builds on the great work that has been accomplished thus far. As we here celebrate our 10th anniversary, covering a decade of distinction and excellence, world-renowned guests like Nobel laureate Michael Kramer, whom we're thrilled to have with us today, add substantially to the excellence of the activities in NYUAD's intellectual and creative community. Our research outputs have the potential to benefit society, the region, and the world, and we're excited to continue fostering new avenues for collaborative research. Although our seminar today is virtual, we're hopeful for a return to the normal rhythms of university life in the coming academic year. Michael, NYUAD is honored to have you as a speaker today, And we would be delighted, of course, to welcome you on our campus in the future. And thanks, Yao, for pioneering and continuing to be at the forefront of the excellence of NYUAD. And I want to thank again all of you for being in attendance.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you for all of your support for everything we do. It's really great having you behind our backs and pushing us and encouraging us. So thank you so much, Ali. Great. So we move right on, and Professor Torsten Walter will introduce our speaker and make a few remarks next. Torsten, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Michael Kramer. Michael is Professor of Economics and the Director of the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago. His contributions to research and society are manifold, so I will not attempt to give you a list of all of them, but instead I will try to briefly give you an overview of some of his most important work, in my view. Michael is both a researcher and a social entrepreneur, and what unifies all of his work is the mission to alleviate poverty. He has received numerous awards, most importantly, the 2019 Economics Nobel Prize for developing an experimental approach to alleviating poverty. But both his contributions to research and to poverty alleviation go beyond developing this specific approach. This is because Michael has also made other important contributions to research, and he has been actively engaged in fighting poverty from a young age on. As a researcher, Michael is best known for pioneering the introduction of randomized control trials into economics. Perhaps most famous is his early work on the effects of dewarming on health and education. And through this work, Michael helped make fieldwork widely accepted in economics and its analysis credible, thereby putting development economics back on the center stage. In addition to this path-breaking work, Michael has also made key contributions to other branches of the literature. In fact, 2 out of his 3 most cited papers are of theoretical nature and deal with economic growth rather than experimental papers. And I'm sure at least some of you are familiar with his O-ring theory. As a social entrepreneur, Michael has also made important contributions to poverty alleviation. In a lot of his work, the boundary between research and policy is actually fluid, and his research and his social engagements have often been complementary. In 1987, Michael founded World Teach, an organization which has placed more than 7,500 volunteer teachers in developing countries since. Following his school-based work on dewarming in the early 2000s, Michael co-founded Dewarm the World, which now brings dewarming to 150 million children annually. Michael's research on safe drinking water led to the Dispensers for Safe Water program. More recently, Michael has co-founded the NGO Precision Development, which uses digital technology to improve productivity and livelihoods of millions of smallholder farmers in developing countries. Currently, Michael's research focuses on 2 things, namely advanced market commitments and development innovation funds. The former line of work is highly relevant in the ongoing global pandemic, and it has already been instrumental to the development of new vaccines in the past. And we hope that it can help ensure the development and production of new vaccines for the developing world in the future. The latter line of work is what Michael is actually going to talk to us about today. More specifically, he will discuss whether development economics is a good investment. Michael, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this event. We are very glad to have you, and the virtual floor is yours now.
Thank you so much for that. Oops, turn on my video here. Thank you so much for that. Those very kind words, Yao and Arle and Torsten. You really appreciate them. Very glad to very glad to be here virtually. Look forward to someday being able to come in person. Have really heard, I'm very excited to hear. I've heard wonderful things about NYU Abu Dhabi from various colleagues, and very excited to learn more about the Dev Lab that's being started. Let me share my slides, and then I can move to this paper. But in Q&A, happy to talk about other issues as well. Great. So this paper is joined with Sasha Gallant, who's at CRI Foundation, joint with Olga Rostopchova at the University of Chicago, and joint with Milind Thomas at the Asian Development Bank. And one thing, let me start with a little bit of a couple of disclaimers. First, I'm at the University of Chicago, and that's really the capacity in which I'm speaking here today. But I am affiliated with USAID and with the Development Innovation Ventures program, which is I'll be discussing data from that. So I'm not a totally disinterested party. I've also been involved with a couple of the innovations that I'll discuss today as well. And let me actually thank one other person. Many people, or two other groups of people. One is there's the staff at Development Innovation Ventures who have been doing a lot of work to help compile some of this data. And then the other person I'd like to thank is Esther Duflo, who was involved in an earlier analysis, and this draws in part on that. Having a bit of trouble advancing my slides. There we go. So there has been many recent initiatives to invest in innovation in international development, and there are a number of these quite different. Some invest in scientific research and development. So if you think about all of the resources that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and many others have put into medical research, for example, to develop vaccines for malaria. There's also a lot of social science research. So again, many people are involved in this, but one major player in this is the World Bank has supported a lot of randomized control trials, but a lot of other work to do research on social science designed to promote innovation. In this case, it's typically innovation in policy and government policy. So also another strand of work that's the impact investing social entrepreneurship world. So just to name a couple of examples of actors there, a Midyar Network or the Skoll Foundation are both very active there. But many universities, I don't know about NYU, but I think many universities support programs for students on this and competitions for social entrepreneurship in international development, but also in other areas. So there's been limited, and I'll discuss this more. There's a tradition of analysis of scientific research and development to try to understand what's the payoff to that, but there's less work on these latter two categories. We're going to draw on data from USAID's Innovation Fund, Development Innovation Ventures, to try to get at two questions. First, is this a good investment? And second, within this area, which innovations tend to scale? So on the first question, the way we'll pose this is, does the return on innovation investment exceed the return on other development investments? There's a lot of, we know that there are a lot of things that can be very successful that are high return investments, just educating children, for example, or taking existing technologies, for health technologies, and trying to spread them more. So this comes at a cost. Any resources that are devoted to innovation might come from other areas. And there are anecdotes of success, but there are also spectacular anecdotes of failure where money has been invested in innovation, and it's been a waste. That type of approach can only take you so far. Some people have tried to move a bit further and tried to do counts. Of this many programs that were funded, how many of them seem to have succeeded according to some metric? I'm going to argue that that method is also has some important limitations. There's, as I mentioned, there's a tradition of assessing returns to scientific research and development that goes back to the 1950s, and there've been quite a few studies on this. Typically, they find very high rates of return. Often, 70% rates of return are not unusual. So what we'll do in this paper is look at innovation for development, and in particular, at social science, RCTs, and at social entrepreneurship. And the technique that we'll use, the methodological innovation here, is to use, it's not a deep innovation, but it's to try to develop a bounding approach. It's very hard to get the data necessary to get an estimate of the return on investment, but we'll try to develop bounds. And then we'll apply that to this early portfolio of a USAID program, Development Innovation Ventures. Okay, so let me give you some background on the program. And one thing to know is that this program is quite different than many other innovation funders. Either some of the funds that you might see at the World Bank on public innovation policy and public sector management, and also quite different from a lot of Skoll or Omidyar or some of the innovation funders for innovations intended to scale commercially. So first, it's open. So it's across sources of innovation. So it's open to private firms or social entrepreneurs, but also open to academic researchers. It's open across sectors. It's not specialized in education or agriculture or energy. It's open across geographies within the range where USAID works. A few US foreign policy considerations come in. I don't think Cuba is eligible, et cetera. And it's open across scaling approaches, public sector or commercial scaling. It's also got a very broad definition of innovation, not just gadgets, but a wide range of new ideas. It has tiered funding, and the idea is to base that on pretty rigorous evidence. So in some ways, this is intended to complement the openness, to put some guardrails on, to avoid funding innovation is inherently risky. So you need some innovations, some guardrails to make sure that you don't throw good money after bad. And the particular approach that was used here is to have 3 stages of funding. So initial funding for piloting new ideas, a second stage of testing them, and that testing really breaks down by the route to scaling that's proposed. So if it's supposed to be funded by the public sector, we'd be looking for rigorous evidence of causal impact and of cost effectiveness. If it's going to scale commercially, we'd be looking for show that this is really viable from a market standpoint, can cover costs. And then for things that make it through that second stage, for the most successful, there's additional funds to transition the idea to scale. And so it's relatively small amounts of funds at stage 1 and stage 2, and then potentially larger amounts at stage 3, but with pretty strict criteria for what can go into that. I'm going to this will be looking at the historical experience, but for those of you who are interested in applying, we definitely encourage people to apply. If you take a look at this website, and happy to share that if afterwards, you can find the current rules, and would love to see more proposals. Okay. Let me say a little bit more about the procurement rules and the sort of the process. So the process was that there was again in the early period, the government procurement rules were quite restrictive, and the staff was very small. So there's very little, if you think about a lot of venture capital funds, for example, a lot of impact investors, the staff will play a very big role in seeking out applicants. When we started, there was the US government procurement rules that we were operating under didn't allow that. There's now a little bit more flexibility. There was also no opportunity back then to really influence the proposals. The proposals were coming in from the applicants, and there wasn't the effort that a lot of venture capitalists might try to make to add value through technical support or links to other parties. There's very little scope for that then. And the selection process relied pretty heavily on peer review, including with development economics researchers. So back then, and again, things have changed now, but the staff, they've changed somewhat. There was staff input, but they didn't really have skin in the game. It wasn't like at a venture capital fund where it's really not just a proposal from an outside applicant, but there's a staff member who's acting as an advocate in some way and writing an investment memo. The decisions early on were based on the initial application. We did make some assessment of potential for scale, but in some ways it was quite different than you might see in some other places. So we focused a lot on cost, under the theory that it's hard for an innovation to scale in low-income areas for low-income people if it's too costly. And we did try to make some subjective assessment of, is it politically feasible for this to scale if it was something that was supposed to scale through governments. We were pretty flexible on the team composition. So something you hear in venture capital is that it's not really the idea they're funding, it's the team. And I think, and I'll come back later at the end of the talk and say why some of these things that seem to go against what some people might consider best practice for the private sector funding might actually work in this case. But we were not necessarily looking for, we funded grad students, with new ideas. We weren't looking for a lot of management experience necessarily, particularly for early stage ideas, because we figured they could hand them off. And then for innovations designed to scale through the public sector, if you look at a lot of World Bank competitions, they'll say, well, we want a separate implementer and an evaluator, and the government needs to be, a large organization like the government needs to be the implementer and needs to have skin in the game and put up the funding for that. We were pretty flexible as far as that. We would fund the innovation as well as the evaluation, even if it was something ultimately designed to scale through the public sector. Obviously, if the government was putting in money, that was a big plus. Okay, let me give you, that's all very abstract. Let me give you some examples of innovations we funded in the early years. So if you look at this first example, this was people from MIT's business school. They were trying to develop a sustainable solution for sanitation in urban slums, trying to use this for fertilizer or for electricity. There was another example was a nonprofit that was working in Vietnam, trying to develop a household hand washing device and trying to scale that commercially. There are, let me show some other examples. Just move this. Okay, this was somebody trying to develop a bicycle tube that wouldn't be subject to punctures. This was an e-bike. Here's something that was more from a social science approach, voter report cards in India to give voters more information about the records of the people running for office. So that gives a little bit of a flavor of the mix. What was our method for assessing whether the benefits exceed cost? So the method is, at some level conceptually, it's very simple. the number of people reached times the net benefits per person after subtracting out costs. One thing we did, if you see a lot of annual reports, they will, of funders in this area, they'll talk about the innovations that they funded that succeeded, but there might be several organizations which all funded some innovation which succeeded. To avoid that double counting problem, if DIV put in 10% of the funds, we only in these calculations, we only counted 10% of the benefits. Now that's an advantage of that is it avoids double counting. If there are lots of different organizations reporting this way, it means you could get at sector-wide returns if you add it up across all the funders. Obviously, this doesn't get at the counterfactual. Maybe some of the innovations would have scaled without this support. I think when we think about the particular cases, I think for most of them, that's probably not the case, but that's a subjective judgment. And okay. Now, I think that's the idea, but then when it comes to practice, it's very difficult to do this. And that there are a lot of innovations where it's very hard to get the data. So for example, some of them, they're just conceptual issues. There are innovations to reduce electoral fraud. How do you put I think that particular innovation was very valuable, but how do you put a dollar figure on it? No idea how to do that. There are other cases where perhaps in theory, you could get an estimate of the dollar value, but we just don't have the data. There are other cases where innovations take a very long time to scale. You can think of things like Google or Facebook, which scaled very rapidly, but most innovations take a long time to scale, and most innovations historically. And in the development sector, that's certainly true as well. Multiple decades often. Think of, and this program is not that old, just over 10 years old. We don't know what the benefits are going to be in the future, but that could be a substantial share of the benefits. So what do we do faced with this? Well, the approach we used was to take advantage of something that shows up in a lot of innovation funding, that there's a very skewed distribution of returns. And in particular, there's a skewed distribution of innovation scale. So we compared the benefit of a subset of just the high scale innovations for which we could get data to the cost of the full portfolio. So obviously it'd be cherry picking if we just pick the winners and compared the benefits of the winners to the cost of the winners, but we're comparing the benefits of the winners to the cost of the full portfolio. And then we just tried to use conservative assumptions throughout. So we use a 10% discount rate for health innovations. The World Health Organization says things are cost effective at 3 times GDP per capita per year of disability adjusted life year averted. We'll use 1 year. They're sort of toughest threshold. And then we'll focus to deal with this time issue. We'll focus on the early portfolio, but we'll only count benefits up till now and not try to project things further. So this is very conservative in a way, but what it gives us is a bound in the sense that if it turns out that the benefits of just that subset of innovations calculated conservatively exceeds the cost that was put into this, well, then that would be an indication that this was a worthwhile investment. This is with the discounting. If you didn't discount, then that wouldn't be a tough enough standard. So let me show you we supported 41 innovations over this period. Here they are ranked by the number of direct beneficiaries as of 2020. And this first thing to notice about this graph is it's extremely skewed. There were 27 innovations which didn't reach that many people. And then you see this very steep upward path after that. And note the can't even put this all on one slide with a consistent axis because the innovation that scaled the most reached 60 million people. So it's very skewed. There were 9 innovations that reached more than 1 million people. So I'm going to focus on those. But then of those, we're only going to be able to quantify benefits for the ones in red. So I'll focus down on those more. One thing I wanted to note is that, the scaling rate that for development innovation ventures looks pretty favorable relative to a lot of other innovation funders. So, for example, there's an effort to call something called the Million Lives Club, which is an ongoing effort. They're still collecting data to try to find innovation supported by the UK DFID, by GCC, USAID, DFAT, Global Innovation Fund. They've looked at, they found 80 innovations that have scaled to more than 1 million. That's out of 2,000, so about a 4% scaling rate. This is 9 out of 41, so a pretty high scaling rate. Okay. For those of, since we have a mathematician here and who's interested in physics, economists don't do this as much, but we should. The top of the distribution here does look a little bit like a power law distribution. Not the whole distribution, but the top of the distribution does. So because this distribution is so skewed, a small fraction of innovations account for a large share of benefits. And that's why by examining only a few innovations, we're able to get a bound that might be informative. So let me go through, I'm going to first go through quickly some of the innovations that are not in our analysis of benefits because we don't have the data on them. So I'll skip the ones in red for later. So I mentioned the voter report cards project earlier. That's now reached 10 million people. There was an initial study found that it reduced vote buying by 19 percentage points. There's an asterisk because the program that was scaled was considerably different. I think that's normal. People, but because things have to be adapted before they can be scaled. But one of the reasons we couldn't, conceptually, it's very hard to put a dollar value on it, but we couldn't assess the benefits of this because the program that scaled differed substantially from the initial program. Okay, let me talk about a few other examples. Another one on elections, actually, done in Afghanistan that reduced theft of election materials was later. So let me just say a bit about the scaling route. Voter report cards, this was scaled up. One of the things we found is that when going into this, we thought things would either scale commercially or by adoption by governments. And many of them seem to have scaled in other ways. So voter report cards scaled because an NGO produced these voter report cards using freedom of information rules, and then newspapers published them because this is, it's free content for them. The election monitoring technology was actually initially done as an experiment by people who were grad students or postdocs at the time, but then was later adopted by a political party in Afghanistan, which was the current president's political party, which was trying to, presumably trying to stop fraud by their opponents. So, was that good or bad? Probably if everybody did this, this would be good, but it's impossible to assess the dollar benefit of that, or even so let me mobile agricultural extension. This is something that I was involved in. I should flag that. This is scaled to reach 3 million people. Let me talk about number 9. So this is something that Asim Khwaja, who is a researcher at Harvard's Kennedy School, developed. But this was done as a private business, trying to do credit assessments, and that their customer was banks. And banks, they didn't sell directly, they didn't lend directly to customers, but they sold the technology to banks. And it's 1.5 billion in loans has been made based on this. Okay, let me talk about the ones where we do have do have a quantitative estimate. So this was a $148,000 investment. This was digital attendance monitoring for health workers that increased doctor-attended births. The DIV put in most of the investment for it. We estimate $500,000 in benefits. This is something where I was involved at an earlier stage in the research on this, but this was scaled up by an NGO. And so I wasn't involved in that. This was a $5 million investment. Now have some new data on the impact of this. We're going to use half of the estimated effect on child mortality to be conservative. 2 million users. We estimate 225 million in net benefits from the DIV share of investment. This is a private firm. They develop cheap glasses. There's a study of tea picker productivity, finding an increase in 22%. They initially planned to sell direct to the consumers. They're now working a lot with other distribution channels, like tea estates, for example. We only have data on tea picker productivity. Not all their customers are tea pickers, so somewhat arbitrarily, we'll cut that in half, but we're trying to be conservative. There we estimate 30 million. These are rough estimates. So if you take these 5 projects and we divide that by the cost of the full portfolio, well, the cost of the portfolio, including an estimate of administration costs, is $16 million. The net benefits is $281 million. So that means the lower bound on the benefit cost ratio is 17. There was a earlier analysis before we got more data, and it was 6 then. It's gone up. I assume that. I think if we extend this over more time and the denominator gets bigger, I don't necessarily assume that this 17 figure will hold indefinitely. Let me note that this is a very conservative estimate, or just remind you in a number of ways. The future benefits, if these projects, if these innovations continue, or if they scale further, that would be, could potentially be very large. It excludes 4 of the 9 innovations with the highest reach. It excludes the innovations reaching less than 1 million people. And we're often not in good shape to measure the externalities, which we're assuming that those are positive on net, and I think that's a reasonable assumption. So let me actually just pause there for a minute. The second half of the presentation will be on which innovations scale and larger lessons for these types of innovation funds with social objectives. But let me pause, and if people have questions or comments on the first part, happy to discuss them.
Hi, Michael. I think you're doing very well. So if I were you, just keep going.
Okay, great.
Just keep going. You're doing great.
Okay, thanks. So let me discuss the second question, which is which innovation scale. So if you believe that this type of, I realize I forgot to say something early on about this being a question. There is a lot of debate. It's very clear that many innovations scale, and that provides that's what drives economic growth. But there are questions about whether this attempt to do innovations for the base of the pyramid really succeeds. And so, and there are lots of examples of failure. And I think what I would take away from this data, the first part of the presentation, is that there's potential for this to scale, but a lot of the benefit is going to come as any investor in innovation is true for investment in innovation in general. If you're a venture capital firm, you invest in 10 firms that don't do so well, but you invest in Google, you're going to be a very successful investor. It looks like that's the type of pattern that we should be expecting. So you want to think about this on a portfolio basis. But then there's the question of how can we manage our portfolio? And there you want to pick the innovations that you think will have a high benefit per person, but also the innovations which scale. And so scale is a necessary condition for social impact, but it's not sufficient. You also need impact on benefit per person, but benefit per person is often very hard to quantify. So we're going to look at a question where we've got more data, which is what are the correlates of scale? We won't have causal impacts here. So how have people addressed this? Well, there's very little academic literature on this, but there are a lot of consulting reports and other reports. And typically the way they do that is they look at the innovations which scaled, and then they interview the people involved in the innovation. They interview others who are buying the product, or who other industry observers, and then they or government officials if it's a public sector innovation, and they then say, well, what were the things the successes seem to have in common? Now, a difficulty in that is if you're identifying the success factors ex post, you may be influenced by the fact that the innovation succeeded. So you get a lot of advice like, you really need to know the customer, or you need a good management team. But if something was successful, then ex post, you're going to call the management team well. And if it was successful, that's probably because the customers liked it. So it sounds like they understood their customer. We're going to take a tougher approach, and we're going to say, what were some innovation when the application came in? What were the characteristics of the innovation or of the applicant that we could quantify in some way? And then we're going to look not just at the successes, but at all of the innovations, and see what factors were associated with success. So let me start with something, and I think what we'll find is a lot of the conventional wisdom turns out not to hold in this, admittedly quite small data set. So one piece of conventional wisdom is that pilots never scale. There are a lot of people in international development who it's almost become a catchphrase. And we had different levels of evidence and different prospects for scaling that were required at different levels. And at first glance, our results look very consistent with that. Only 17% of the pilot grants scaled, 25% of the ones where we were collecting evidence scaled. And we only had one stage 3, so obviously none of this is statistically significant, but that one succeeded. So that looks consistent. But let me show you another way of looking at the same data, which is to look at the amount of money that was spent at each stage, and look at the number of people reached, and then calculate the people reached per dollar. And there you see that the stage 1 and stage 2 grants, look very good. Now, I don't want to, we only have one stage 3 grant. I don't want to I wouldn't want people to draw the conclusion that we should just fund early stage things and not larger stage. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence that looked at in cost effectiveness terms, that the stage 1 grants that the pilot grants are a mistake. Let me just say one other thing about sort of the distinction between stage 1 and stage 2 grants. And this is not from Development Innovation Ventures, it's from my own experience as a researcher. So I had worked on developing this water treatment dispenser, and that has dilute chlorine solution in it. And before we did an RCT, as almost all researchers in this area do, we just tried a very small scale pilot, and the reason why chlorine is effective at killing germs is because it reacts with everything. And indeed, we got advice from some people who we would have thought knew what they were doing, but they recommended a component in this that turned out to react with chlorine. And so you don't need so that deteriorated very quickly, and you don't need an RCT to measure the impact of that. You first want to pilot and develop the innovation before you get to the stage of doing a randomized controlled trial. Okay, so let's look at some other characteristics. So I mentioned cost, and so that does look like it's very important. So there were some of these innovations that cost less than $3, others cost more. We were looking at we're focused on international development and poverty alleviation rather than, say, the environment. So there might be, Teslas have been very successful and they cost a lot more than $3. But for this purpose, at least cost seems like a very important driver of scalability. Maybe I'm speaking too strongly. It's a correlate. Okay. Another factor, which I think is closely tied, is whether the innovator proposed setting up a new distribution network. I think there's this image that a lot of us have of innovation, which is, sort of starts out in a garage in Silicon Valley, and then they build up the business and it grows over time, and you're selling to the ultimate consumer. But of course, a lot of businesses sell to other businesses or sell to governments. And it's quite costly to set up your own distribution network. And if you're selling a product that's worth less than $3, the customer acquisition costs can be really daunting. So I don't want to claim it's impossible. But when we looked at the proposals that relied on setting up on sort of direct-to-customer sales, where they'd need their own distribution network, as opposed to, business to business, or getting a government to adopt this, or researchers working with businesses. There was a much lower rate of scaling when the innovation required setting up its own distribution network. And the third area is on whether there was a previous RCT. So I think a lot of people in international development, again, I've got a stake in these last two, so you can discount appropriately. But a lot of people in development feel like having a formal trial of impact and effectiveness is, that's slows things down. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it's better to use just very rapid feedback mechanisms. They're not, but perhaps not as formal. And what we found was we didn't see any evidence for that. So again, we're just looking at scaling here. We're not looking at the actual benefit per person because we don't have enough data on that. But the argument often is that you slow down scaling by trying to do this testing. And we don't see evidence for that argument. Now, what caused this correlation? That we don't know. It's a correlation. We don't know. It could be that the entrepreneurs or NGOs that were confident that they had a good innovation, they proposed randomized controlled trials to show that their impact, and the other ones which were less confident didn't. There was no causal effect of the RCT. It could be that because this wasn't selling to individual consumers, typically, the successful ones were adopted by large businesses or were adopted by governments, that maybe the RCT had an impact because you can show the person running an insurance company the results of a anti-traffic accident program, and then if they may pay attention to the results of that in deciding whether to adopt. Let me suggest a third possible reason, which is, and I think this returns to some of the themes that Torsten was emphasizing. There are a lot of fields of inquiry in which people think it's quite natural that researchers would get involved in and perhaps even add value to the process of developing innovations. There's an image, if you think back to the a lot of the mid 20th century. There's an image when physics was producing a ton of innovations and often very theoretical. I guess if you think about after the development of the atomic bomb, that came from very, very abstract, very theoretical work. And there was a sort of an image of a one-way flow. The ideas come from math and then maybe make it into physics, and then you do things in very fundamental physics that seem unrelated to the rest of the world, and then eventually something comes out that really affects the world. But I think the modern view of science is that there's a constant interflow between innovation and science, and that ideas that come out of practical applied problems often influence science, and vice versa. So it's not unidirectional. And it's therefore not strange if you think about in biotech firms, many of them are founded by people who were researchers. Or if you think about Google, this was founded by grad students. So in ICT and in biotech, we don't think it's strange that that there's some connection there. I think we may be reaching a stage in economics where at least in some areas of economics, this is about development economics, but I think also other areas of economics, and perhaps most starkly in theory, where there is quite abstract work done by theorists, but then that feeds directly into auction design, and then their work on practical auction design or practical problems like kidney exchange feed back into the development of the theory. So it does look like, if you look at these last two parts of the graph, it does look like previous RCT and involvement of economics researchers is not a negative. And we don't know the story, but one possibility is that there are things about research in this area that actually are useful in developing practical innovations. I should say these last two things are very collinear with each other, so we can't really separate out the effects from each other. Okay. I might have the wrong, I thought I deleted that slide. Anyway, I could show you the lasso, but I'm not going to do that. Let me suggest a potential model that might explain some of these results. Imagine that there are some factors which drive the private return to innovations and the social returns to innovation in the same direction. So, if it's a gadget and that gadget breaks after 2 years, the company's not going to make much money and it's not going to benefit society very much. There might be, however, some other factors which systematically lead to differential effects on private returns, whether the company is going to make money, and on social returns, the benefit to society. So one of the principles that Warren Buffett emphasizes in investing is think about whether there's in particular investing in innovation, think about whether there's a moat. In other words, Google is a fabulously successful company. Why is that? Well, in part because once they get a lot of users, they're getting more and more data on search that allows them to improve their search. And perhaps even more so, Facebook, there's a huge advantage once you're already started. That makes it hard for others to compete with you. That makes you profitable, but it might not be good for society. So if it's easy for new firms to come in and compete, well, that generates social benefit. That's valuable from a society's point of view, but it makes it a less good investment. So that's the first assumption, that there are some factors that drive things the same way, others which drive them in different directions. Second assumption is that I misedited this. The innovators have private information. The people running the company or coming up with the idea know more about whether it's going to work or not work or what the risks are. But of course, when they submit the grant proposal or do their pitch, they're going to emphasize the positive, not the negative. That's supposed to be that the investors can invest in information acquisition. So they can learn more, but it takes effort and time and skilled people. The third assumption is that there are a lot of very skilled, very highly motivated commercial investors that are seeking privately profitable innovations. There's a whole bunch of venture capital firms out there trying to find great investments. I think the public sector investors may be a lot less nimble in certain ways. They're limited in the salaries they can pay. They have to follow certain bureaucratic rules, perhaps for very good reasons, to avoid fraud and so on, or avoid sort of stealing public money. But that does perhaps make them less nimble. So in that type of a situation, there's a certain risk that the public sector investors are going to be at a real disadvantage. The private sector guys are, or women, are going to be looking for, they're going to be having highly skilled people, very strongly incentivized, and they may grab all the good deals, and the public sector investors may be behind. So it may be quite hard for a government to run an innovation fund. And that's often the perspective that economists have, that it's we shouldn't be trying to pick winners. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. But nonetheless, it looks like there was at least one example of success here. So let me sort of sketch out a little bit more what the implications of these assumptions might be. And how would you get positive social returns as with all of the limitations, many of which I outlined at the beginning? So the hypothesis is that commercial investors are going to leave arbitrage opportunities for socially motivated investors. That could be the public sector, could be a private foundation like the Skoll Foundation or Midyar. And the area where they're going to leave these arbitrage opportunities are areas where there's low expected private returns, but we have reasons to think there might be high social returns. So what might be some of those examples? Well, one is this moat example. If you think about, in cases where there's low barriers to entry, there might be innovations that would be very good for the world, but it might be very hard for a firm to make money out of it. So what would be an example of that? Well, RCTs might be an example, or involvement of academics. The academics are going to publish things. If we think about, actually, in some ways, some of the most convincing evidence comes from the counterexamples. One of the private sector innovations that was most successful here was this developing these algorithms that banks could use in predicting who was going to default on their loan, simply based on asking people a bunch of questions to do some psychometric assessment. Questions like about their honesty, about their tendency to follow through on commitments, things like that. Where you would think people could lie, but it nonetheless turned out to be predictive. This was done by an academic, but the academic in this case, was not, did this in their private sector capacity in their spare time. And so they weren't publishing articles on this because that would have been very bad for their business. Why would the banks purchase the technology if they could just duplicate it themselves? So a second area, so something, the involvement of these researchers could be a negative from private returns. It's probably a positive for social returns because if more people have access, that's useful. Another case would be when getting the returns requires a proprietary complementary asset. So this is, there's a lot of analysis in the patent and intellectual property issue or literature about how firms will be underinvest from a social point of view in innovations that are only useful if combined with somebody else's patent. Well, I think in some of these cases, there was something somewhat analogous going on. If it's very hard to distribute yourself, and the only way you can distribute is by harnessing the network of a distribution network or distribution system that's owned by somebody else. Let's say, this is a way of improving third grade math teaching. Well, the government controls the schooling system. They're not necessarily going to pay you that much for developing some new curriculum. Or the newspapers, they're happy to publish the free reports the NGO puts out on these voting report cards, but they're not necessarily going to be willing to pay a lot of money for it. So that discourages private investors, but it might leave some high social return innovations. And then the final case would be if the consumer doesn't obtain the full value of the product. So think about the water innovation. If a customer uses safe water, that benefits not only themselves, but it makes them less likely to pass on disease. So I think you could systematically look for areas where the private return might be modest, but the social return might be higher, is the hypothesis here. And just to be a little bit more concrete, if you think about, there's obviously a host of innovations which are very good for the world and are privately profitable. I mean, look, different people may have different opinions on this, but I would think of, ride-hailing apps as good for the world, and some companies are making a lot of money. Or mobile phones, that's a clearer example. Low-cost motorcycles. There's all these, business people setting up on transport businesses in Africa using low-cost motorcycles. Presumably, the motorcycle companies are making money, and a lot of people are getting employment, and people can get where they need to go. But there are not so many examples you can point to. There are a few, but not so many examples of things that were supported by social innovation funders trying to help the bottom of the pyramid. I guess mobile money had some support from the UK government, but it was overwhelmingly just private investment. Okay, there's another area, the sort of upper left corner, that likely to be profitable, but are bad for arguably quite bad for society. So alcohol, cigarettes, et cetera. So obviously, social investors aren't going to want to invest there. Then there's a pretty big area in the lower left of things that were just attracted socially minded investment but failed. And again, people might have slightly different judgments on one laptop per child, but I'm not. I guess I don't think of that as a huge success. But in the lower right-hand corner, there are things that might not make that would not have attracted that much private investment without social money coming in, but that yield social benefits, and where we might expect the social benefits to be greater than the private benefits. So some of these, like rotavirus vaccine, presumably the company that developed that is now making money, but they had to do a lot of R&D costs, they had to do a lot of testing, and it might be that they didn't see it profitable if they had to cover all those costs. But if some socially minded investor can come in, they could help cover some of those costs, and then it becomes profitable to continue. The company making the software for community health workers, I should have spent more time on that, but that's an example. I think that might turn into a profitable business for that firm, but they did seek funding from social funds because they had a lot of costs in getting to that point. Then there are probably some things which will never yield any real money, and those might require some continuing support. But I think that I guess what it would take from this is, a lot of investors are looking for area A, the thing that's going to be privately profitable for them and socially valuable. And I think there are some things in that, but they're pretty hard to find because there's a lot of people competing for them, and the developers of the innovation are going to sort of tell you a really positive story. And I think it might also make sense to think about area B and area C. Okay. I think this not only has implications for how you select innovations, but for how you design social innovation funds. I noted that there were a lot of features that differed from standard impact investing features. I was later involved in discussions about setting up other social innovation funds. And it was very interesting talking to very smart people who had experience in venture capital funds. And there were some things that I thought would make sense to do, and they thought were sort of a waste of time or possibly negative. And I think if you have this lens of what contributes to social value and what contributes to private value, it's very clear why these would not really be appropriate for a venture capital company, but they might well be appropriate for a social investor. So for example, giving feedback to rejected applicants. The venture capital person who I was working with, his view was, this takes time. It's going to make people, they're not going to like the negative reviews. They're going to not like you. They're going to, you might get a lawsuit if they disagree. Why would you ever do this? Well, my own view is that you generate a lot of, I'm one of the few people who actually likes getting few academics who likes getting referee reports. It can be painful the first day, but you go back and read it the next day, and you learn something from it, and your innovation gets better. So there's a social benefit, but obviously the venture capital company doesn't make anything from it. But if your objective is social, then it's worth doing. Extensive external peer review. So venture capital firms do peer review, but there's a limit to how much they do it, because ultimately you might be, giving a rival an idea, and you don't want to be doing that. The researcher involvement I mentioned earlier, if somebody's going to publish a paper on the innovation, that makes it easier for somebody to copy, sort of takes away from the moat. The support for the early stage innovations. Often, listen, often I just talking about an application, a more recent application, it's a very small firm. They had an idea. I think if you were looking at that as a private investor, you might say, who knows if this idea is going to work? It probably won't work. That would be wasting my money. That would be okay if there was a really big payoff if it succeeded. But in the case of this small firm, if they succeed, they're probably going to the big firms are just going to adopt the technology and drive them out. So there's no percentage in investing. But from a social point of view, there might well be. So I think that's one of the reasons why we get a fairly high rate of return, and I don't say rate of return, a fairly high rate of scaling with the early stage innovations, because we're measuring whether the innovation scaled rather than whether the applicant necessarily scaled up. And then finally, I would say openness across sectors. If you're one of many venture capital firms, if you're the top venture capital firm, then you'll get all sorts of applicants. Maybe you can be open. But if you're not the top one, then you have to worry about the winner's curse. The people are coming to you. Maybe they got turned down by 10 other venture capital firms. Maybe those venture capital firms saw something you didn't see. How do you solve that problem? Well, you might specialize in a very particular area. We fund this very particular type of innovation, and we've got expertise in that. And then if different firms do that, they have to worry less about the winner's curse. That probably does make sense in the private sector. But for a social funder, there's less, there aren't so many social funders. So openness, that problem is diminished. So openness across sectors may be successful in this context, even if it wouldn't be for a venture capital firm. Okay, I've been talking for a while. What are key findings? First, there's a skewed distribution of innovation reach. And that means you can't just appeal to anecdotes. You can't do counts of, most of the things you funded were failures. You have to do a portfolio level analysis. And you have to recognize that a few big winners may pay for everything. So the methodology we developed is designed to be able to cover cases like that. When we do that for this, couple of years of portfolio for this one innovation fund, we find very high returns. I think that at least suggests there's, and 17-fold, again, I don't know whether that will hold up over once we look at more years of investments, but it suggests there's potentially high returns to investing in development innovation. If this number is bigger than one, it's worth doing. So, happy to settle for something much smaller. Innovations are much more likely to scale if they're low unit cost, if they can harness a pre-existing distribution network, for example, selling to other businesses or governments. And we find that previous RCT or researcher involvement was helpful. There were some things that succeeded spectacularly without that, interestingly, they often did later do RCTs. The eyeglass one, they were initially trying to sell to individual customers. They later switched to doing an RCT and then using that to sell to institutional customers. But we classified them by their initial proposal. So I guess the final thing I would say is this is a small data set. And I think it'd be really helpful for other programs or other funders to track their reach and their impact and their financing. And then we could get more comprehensive data on this and perhaps be able to learn more about whether these patterns hold more broadly. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really great. Let me dive into some questions for you from the audience, okay? I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes.
So first question is, how were the projects selected, okay? And let me add to that. So the question is just, what was the selection mechanism? And just to sort of, push you a little bit, there have been some critiques of the RCT methodology. And to put it a little bit crudely, the questions being asked are small questions. I'm sure you've heard that many times. The big developmental questions are not being asked, can't be asked in a RCT framework. So maybe you can answer both questions. How was the selection of the projects? How did that take place? Maybe some facts. And then answer the bigger question, is there screening of, so in other words, the only projects you'll be looking at are those which are, again, if I was being, harsh, being small enough to be done by RCT, so you have self-selection away from these bigger things. So over to you.
Okay, great. Well, I would really pretty sharply divide the two questions, so I'll try and answer them separately. So first one, I'm going to put on my researcher hat and say, I think there are some questions that can be answered with RCTs, and RCTs can be useful. The one tool in the toolkit that applies to some questions doesn't apply to a lot of other questions, which are really important. And as social scientists, we should be asking a wide variety of questions. So when I'm at the University of Chicago now, but when I was at Harvard, some of my colleagues in the economics department were Melissa Dell and Nathan Nunn, each of whom were asking very important questions about what are the long-run historical influences on development. I totally support that type of work. Or, I also totally support, work of purely abstract economic theorists, because I think that in some cases that remains abstract work and is intellectually very nice, but in other cases, it's not only intellectually very nice, but it turns out to have practical applications. So I support a wide range of things. People specialize. That's how I don't actually specialize that much, but people specialize, and so there may be a lot of this, and I think there's specialization over time. When I was a grad student, a lot of people were working on economic growth. Then there was a period. I think over time, this stuff all gets added to a toolkit and it can be used as appropriate. I do think that turned out you can answer a lot of questions that wouldn't have anticipated you could answer. And there is a lot of interplay with theory now, which I think is great. And so I wouldn't subscribe to the pessimistic view of that, but I definitely endorse other types of research. So that's answering with my researcher hat on. Okay, if I put on the other hat of working for the U.S. government on this program, so their objective is not to support research at all. Their objective, that might be a byproduct, but their objective is to, they want to. This part of the U.S. government is supposed to be. I mean, there's all, as I say, there are foreign policy things that come in, but it's a big part of it is to improve reduce poverty and improve health and so on. So they're looking for concrete things that can have an impact. Those don't have to be, a lot of this is supporting social entrepreneurs. And if you looked at, that's partly why I went through the examples of the bicycle tires and the hand washing devices. And, that was a lot of what we supported. So it was not all things with researchers. It was a real mix. And, some of the, let me note that a lot of the, there were important successes in each category. And I think each category is very important. So, how did we select? So I think the key part of how we selected was having this phased evidence-based approach. So the first phase being piloted. Note that that's not an RCT. Another critique of RCTs is, which I think I wouldn't call a critique, I would say it's recognizing this is one tool. It's not the right tool when you're first trying out your idea. You want to pilot first. The second phase was testing. That didn't necessarily, I guess, again, my own view influenced by economics is if you're spending public money, then you might want some rigorous evidence. You can't do that for everything, and it wouldn't be appropriate for everything, but we wanted to put some discipline on, because when you're running an investment fund like this, and you say, well, we're open to proposals from anywhere, people can sell you ideas that sound good, and you can get behind them, and you can wind up wasting a lot of money. So before we spent big money, and I would also say we were, USAID had certain priorities, and those change over the years, Energy, they change with the political winds, they change with the crises that they're focusing. Those things, the US government does spend money even without this evidence, and that might be appropriate. But for things that are not agency priorities, it's worth having some windows so you can get ideas over the transom, but not to put big money into it until there's evidence. That evidence could be for something government would do. A randomized trial doesn't have to be, has to be rigorous evidence. But for something scaling privately, I don't see any need for an RC. If there's a solar light out there and the customers are willing to pay for it, it's probably, I don't need to see, all of these companies claim it increases the amount of time kids can do homework and improves their learning. That would be nice, but if the customers are willing to pay the full cost of it, then that's probably good for the world even without that additional evidence. So we don't require RCTs at all for things that are going to scale commercially. But then we do really want to see somebody to look at it from a very hard-headed financial perspective. Are they really paying the full cost, or are you not covering the cost of the distribution network, for example, and it looks like a good business, but it's not really a good business?
Thank you so much. Very, very great answer, a very humble answer as well. As somebody on the chat said, I shouldn't be mentioning RCTs. What are RCTs? So for all of you, it's part of what Michael won the Nobel Prize for. It's the experimental method. Simply, simple explanation. Half of them get the treatment, half of them do not. You look at the difference. So my apologies for using that terminology. So here's a second question on the feed. Amartya Sen says agency is important. Is scaling in conflict with agency? Another related question, what are the political engineering implications, especially as you scale? Or to put it in another way, there's been some criticism of many of our experiments. You take an experiment, for example, where there's a large RCT and you're interfering with the political process, right? You're changing things. You want to see how that affects voting, right? And that voting may affect one party as opposed to another. You can imagine if a foreign country was running experiments in the United States, what Americans would be saying about the electoral process. I mean, we all saw what happened there. So any comments on agency, power, as we're doing these experiments and as USAID is scaling up some of these things, especially the more sensitive ones?
Right. So, I think that one thing that we try to do, but I'm sure we could do much better, is to try and be open to proposals from all over the world. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to put up the address so you can see the forum so that we can do that. But I think we could do much better on outreach. And a lot of the innovations that were successful, let me give you an example of one that I went over too quickly. But one of them was about road safety, and in East Africa and many other parts of the world, there are a lot of deaths from minibuses that are driving really fast because the drivers are get to keep the money they make at the end of the day after paying the rent on the minibus, and it's a big public health issue. Well, a pair of researchers, one was Australian, but the other was from Uganda, came up with this idea, which sounds a little crazy, which is, let's put stickers in the bus to tell the passengers to speak up if they feel that it's not safe. Well, it turned out that idea was not crazy at all. And in fact, it seems to have worked. They actually had done a randomized control trial before they came to us, and they had evidence that it worked, but there were a few problems with that study, and they wanted to do it again more carefully. And what we found was what they found, I should say, and this was, I forget which scientific journal it was published. It was published in a scientific journal. They found very prestigious one. They found substantial reductions in traffic accidents. Basically, lots of customers were feeling nervous, but they all felt like they couldn't speak up. But having the sign there sort of gave them common knowledge that this was socially acceptable to do. And then they spoke up, and that seems to have deterred the drivers from the worst forms of misbehavior. So they monitored. This was they worked with the insurance companies. They monitored the data from the insurance companies on claims, and they saw that accidents went down. And then the insurance company, together with the Kenyan government, scaled this up. So I think that's an example of the type of insight that you get from you really knowing the context. And if we went, even more broadly, this is not related to Development Innovation Ventures, but something else that I'm involved in. There's a program called the Weiss Fund, which initially started in a not very open way. It was supporting a couple of universities in Boston, three universities in Boston. But thanks to the generous support of the Weiss family, this grew over time. And after the Nobel Prize announcement, Esther Abhijit and I together, we decided to donate our prize funds, but then together with a much larger contribution from the Weiss family to try to make this program international and to try to supports research, particularly by graduate students and junior faculty. This is a development economics research, so it's different than this. It's not just about innovations, but it's supposed to be innovations. It's supposed to be development economics research that can have a practical impact. So the program has recently greatly expanded its scope. It's in a transition period, so it's expanded for junior faculty, but not yet for grad students. That we'll have to think about how to do that logistically. But that's very small awards, but designed to help kickstart this process. So I hope we'll see more efforts. So a number of governments, sorry, I'll shut up in a minute, but a number of governments, Peru, Tamil Nadu, have set up their own efforts to use this process. And I think that's very exciting.
Excellent. Let me try two more quick questions on you in the remaining 3 minutes we have. One question says, if you could redesign your data collection from scratch, how would you have redesigned it to do what you're doing now?
Yeah, it's funny. The data that USAID initially collects, they give a grant. There's a project report due at the end of the period. But if you're funding innovation, and they say what they did, but if you're funding innovation, the benefits of the innovation might be much later. And they would continue. And it might in fact be that this was adopted by somebody else completely different. So trying to design the data collection so it goes on in an ongoing way would make sense. I would not say that you need, if there's a company with that solar light that's succeeding, I don't want them to necessarily have to spend their time measuring the benefits per person reached precisely. I don't want the measurement to distort the funding decisions. But I think there are some things that could be done to improve that.
And then maybe in conclusion and sort of as a way to thank you for your concern for poorer people, I have a comment here. How do you see government spending a huge amount of money for Mars exploration while there is so much poverty on Earth? Okay, so the government is spending to go to Mars, and here on Earth, we are all struggling. So any last comment on that?
Yeah, I guess, I try to be realistic about things, and most of the expenditure that governments do is going to be, and politicians face strong incentives, and most of the expenditure is going to be things that directly benefit their voters. If you think about something like Mars, I'm actually can be reasonably sympathetic to that, because if you think about, let's say this is US government expenditure, there's 300 million people. Some of them care, I don't know how much the Mars expenditure costs, but people get some value out of that. And some people get a lot of value. This is very far afield, but a lot of American city governments subsidize sports teams. There are a lot of people in these cities who get immense joy out of that, and it may be worth it for them to do it. So I'm actually, I haven't studied it, I don't know, but I wouldn't say that that's necessarily, yes, there's a higher social value used for that money in some abstract sense for the world, but among the amounts, among the category of expenditure that governments are doing to benefit their citizens, this may be worth it.
Okay. So that brings us to the end of our conversation here. I really enjoyed it. Great work. It's really great that you're sort of conceptualizing the whole sort of development space. So thank you. I enjoyed it. And just a big shout out to you as well. You've had a life of helping poorer people from Kenya through India, through everything. So we're all very proud of you, and thank you for everything you've done. So. On behalf of all of us, NYU Abu Dhabi Dev Lab, a big shout out to NYU, the Abu Dhabi Institute for all their work, and for all of you who showed up today. So thank you all. That brings us to the end of our event. I thank my Africa House team, Aditi, Andrea, and all those who worked on this. Thank you, Torsten, as well. And God bless. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good. Very good to see you.
All right. Good to see you too. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.